Dr. Jessica Ash here. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning in Australia. I am very honored to be accompanied today by Dr. Gulbahar Beckett of Iowa State, but also she is the Associate Editor for Diaspora, Indigenous, and Minority Education, as well as Dr. Ahmar Mahboob, or Professor Nomad from the University of Sydney. We are here today to discuss revitalization of Indigenous knowledges, or you could call it decolonization. So welcome, Dr. Beckett and Dr. Mahboob.
Thank you.
Dr. Beckett, could you introduce yourself first, and then we'll have Dr. Mahboob introduce himself, and then we'll get started?
Sure. Yes, I'm a full professor at Iowa State University in Applied Linguistics and Technology program. I do co-edit, as I'm an associate editor of Diaspora, Indigenous, and Minority Education Journal, and have been doing that for a long time, and as a way to contribute to revitalizing Indigenous languages and cultures. And by my research foci includes sociolinguistics, so that's the connection between that journal work and what I teach. And and some of my sociolinguistics work has to do with language policy, language practices, including English as a medium of instruction, content-based instruction, project-based instruction, etc.
Yes, you're both of you. You have long lists of accomplishments over the years, and we may not have time to list all of them at this moment.
Right. Yes. Published widely. Yes.
Okay. So let's go on to Dr. Mahboob's brief introduction.
Good morning, everybody. From Sydney, it's 9 o'clock here. In the morning, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Sydney. I've, as Jessica said, I've sort of evolved in my research and my orientation. I started off as a school teacher, became an English language teacher, became an applied linguist, teacher educator, linguist. Over the period of time, I've been looking at and understanding the nature of language and the nature of knowledge construction. And what is knowledge, and how do we construct it, and how does it relate to the experiences of the world that we live in? So in a sense, my work has moved into the area of decolonization and issues of power and power struggles within places of knowledge construction, I guess, primarily. And so hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that.
Yes. As you may know, that I had a similar conversation with a gentleman from Bangladesh, a doctor from Bangladesh, and one from India earlier today while Dr. Mahboob was sleeping in Australia. So I encourage both of you to check those out. They brought up some very interesting issues, and we found it valuable in that conversation to start with colonization. And what problems did colonization bring that decolonization may be able to solve for either of you?
Sure, I can start if you like, and Gulbahar, you can follow on. So I guess for me, I like to understand, to conceptualize colonization first. So to understand what do we mean by colonization? So typically people think of colonization as a geopolitical movement through which a group of people from one part sort of took over other parts of the world. Well, yes, that's part of it, but that's not all. Colonization really means and implies essentially a creation of a hegemonic discoursive structure that sustains and maintains the elites and the people in power, which today don't necessarily relate to color as much as they do to the notion of greed. And it is that greed that is essentially the colonizing influence, and through that, it's a control and management of how people think, or what people think, how people see the world, what people see in the world, and through those managing those things, sort of being able to direct people's behavior. So in a sense, what colonization is in a sense, in a nutshell, is a way of managing people's behaviors and practices and performances and perceptions, so that a certain group of people are advantaged, whereas the rest are disadvantaged. So that's how I see colonization.
Yeah, and I'll add right here that it was said earlier, and this might resonate with you, Ahmar, that one of the professors said that in India, that some people's minds were polluted to try to clamber after all of the privileges that the British government was offering, and that caused so many problems within the country, that you had almost this divide, because some people were achieving things according to this colonizing system. Gulbahar, I'd like to give you a moment to speak about colonization.
Well, that is one way to colonize, which is you give advantage to enough numbers of people in a community which you are planning to colonize, and you groom a group of people who not only speak on behalf of you, but also act and appear as though that this is a good thing. And you also make it look like the other people would entice the rest of them to follow and to work towards achieving that goal.
So what challenges do you see linguistically? This is for both of you too. I'll just let you both speak. Linguistically, culturally, and scientifically, regarding the vestiges that remain of colonization.
So many, right? I'll let you begin. You've done some work on this, yeah.
Maybe what I can do is connect it also to the last question, and then maybe also something that I promised in my abstract is that I will start with a poem. So I think this poem, in a sense, also captures some of the things that Jessica has alluded to, and things I think we will be building on during the talk. So let me just share the screen as well. So can you see my screen?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, now we can.
Reformation. What nice words to hide the barbarianism unleashed by ruthless stealers of lands and lives, who manufacture misery at a mass scale. Fueled by an insatiable greed of infinites and theft from faraway lands, the enlightened take what they like and leave darkness behind. Breaking up systems, exploiting sciences, turning others' knowledge into weapons of conquest. Gunpowder from the Chinese, navigation, mathematics, chemistry from the Middle East. And once done with all their mischiefs, they put on nice clothes, go to an opera or a museum to celebrate civilization and progress. So, Yeah, I think I'll just read this poem as my response to your question, Jessica, because I think it sort of transitions us both from what we were talking about, what is colonization, by exemplifying the certain ways in which it operates, and also looks at the experiences of a majority of people around the world. Um, and as I said, I think today, we're stuck still in concepts such as race and issues, but these things are really not important. What really matters today is greed. If you've got a greedy person, it doesn't matter what color or what race they have. The greedy person can have any color, and they will do essentially what any colonizer would do. So, in a sense, colonization has become disassociated with color over the last 200 years or so. And today we have people of any color who colonize others. And we see that in terms of the onion layers of oppression that people experience in certain parts of the world. So that it's not just the direct colonization from the Western powers, to say, but rather the layers of national, provincial, state level, even city level and district level, groups and people who are greedy, and those greedy people operate exactly the same way. They operate to benefit themselves at the cost of others, and that is, as I said, a definition of colonization. So anyway, I'll stop here. Gulbahar, please go on.
Yes, I agree. It's not just one language colonizing other languages. It's not one nation colonizing other nations, or one race colonizing other races. This is something that I've been thinking about, especially the last year or so, when this decolonization is now happening, not just as at the discussion and intellectual writing and publishing and kind of level, but it has moved to a different level, including removing statues, for instance. And so it has heightened my thinking and my awareness of the impact of colonization. And then while the people that I noticed discussing colonization, what seems to be missing is the discussion about intralingual, intranational, intra-regional, intra-ethnic, the kind of colonizations. Then I started wondering, wouldn't it be nice that we also start discussing what's happening in that area also? So I agree, definitely. It's not just one against the rest. The one, again, being language, color, nation, region, etc. It happens at all levels. And I think it's time that we also discuss intro-colonization. And I'm noticing that not much of that happens.
Yeah. One thing that you're both making me think of is the fact that 6 or 7 men control the majority of the wealth in the world. And we're calling it capitalism, and we all buy into it. And we're all like, yeah, you go ahead. You 6 men, you control all the wealth of the world. And we're just, here we are on Facebook. We're giving him, Mark Zuckerberg, his money. And it's ironic that we buy into these systems that exist. And linguistically, we're all trained in linguistics. And so I know, and it's so sad to me that when a language dies, real knowledge is lost. And if you take the case of Pakistan, where Ahmar was born, like the people are clamoring on to this idea of an English education, and I'd like Ahmar to speak a bit about Pakistan, since Bangladesh and India were discussed earlier, in regards to, like, in particular, education and language, and why isn't Urdu more central to what's going on in Pakistan?
Speaking of intra, you go ahead.
Gosh, we can stay here for a very long time.
Go ahead, it's all yours. It's your floor.
I think let me abstract it out a bit, so that even though I will exemplify from Pakistan, I will try to abstract it out so that we can understand these issues in a larger sort of a context as well. Now, there are multiple things that we need to consider here. Now, in terms of when you started off, you talked about the handful of rich people who manage the world's economic resources, and how we are all born into a world where we don't have much of an option. So I think maybe we can take a little pause here just to think about what the implications of what you said are. Firstly, I think when we talk about any number of people holding control through a particular system, especially when we talk about economic system, then we need to understand what economic system is. What is an economic system? What do we mean by it? Essentially, in our experience of life as an individual human being, we experience economic system as our ability to generate an income, which is money, typically, and then to be able to have sufficient money to be able to use it for various things. So money is essentially the tool of modern economics, right? Now, this is where things get really interesting, and ties into colonization, really. Now, this is a feature of European colonization, Western European colonization, which does not seem to appear in many parts of the world before that particular experience of humanity, human experience. And that is that there is a way in which the European colonizers were able to turn certain things which were finite into things that were infinite. And then they controlled the infinite. They became the managers of the infinite. The finite is gone. People are lost in the infinite. Let me exemplify this. So, for example, in the case of the economic system, before European colonization created and distributed and made us all believe that money is the primary tool of an economic system, money didn't exist. Now, I am not saying that money or coins or currencies were not invented at various points in time across human civilizations. There's tons of archaeological evidence to show that currencies and coins and other systems of exchange, symbolic exchange, existed. But notice, these things typically were in the value of the material itself, so that an ounce of gold is the value of the ounce of gold, right? The material itself is the value. And the material is limited, it is finite in the world that exists. So gold is limited around the world, hence the gold rush, right? So my adopted land, people where I've been adopted, far up north Queensland, are the gold rivers, are the gold mountains. Why did the gold rush happen? Because gold was given a symbolic value by by people, not just the European, but by a lot of people. But notice, gold is a material resource. Yes, there's a greed for it and there's a rush for it. And that happened. But like in other contexts, what the Europeans were able to manage very successfully is to dislink or de-link value with the actual material. How? Through the creation of a numerical currency system. Notice a numerical currency system by itself does not carry the value. Today, I don't even carry many banknotes, but if I did have a banknote, the banknote itself doesn't have value. It has value because the Australian government or some other government says it has value. It's not like gold, right? So notice the ability to generate money now is unlimited, it's infinite, because it's a printing press and it's printing infinitely. There is no limit to the count for number. So growth, when measured through an economic system, measured through dollars and numbers, is essentially an infinite concept, pegged on a currency that is based on a concept of an infinite. Yet, we have certain powers and groups in the world that tend to be able to manage and are the controllers of that infinite. So that in your and my experience, money is very finite. I only get so much money every month. That's it. I come from a refugee background. I don't come with a big inheritance. I don't have money. My money is my salary every month. That's my income. That's very limited, right? So for me, money is experienced in a very limited way. But that doesn't mean that money itself is limited. Money itself is infinite. Now notice the idea of turning a finite into an infinite is something that is very commonly done in and through in European ways of conceptualizing and understanding the world, but also it is done through language. Notice how very often practices which are actual material events that can be observed through your sensory systems, those behaviors and practices are also turned into abstractions. And whereas a material practice is finite, right? So if I'm moving my hands now, it's a finite time I will do it for. I will stop at some point, like I have done now. So yes, there was movement of my hand, which you were able to observe. That movement of my hand was finite and limited. But if I turn my movement of hand and I create a symbolic value for it, then the symbolic value and its relationship to a nomenclature that is purely symbolic and nominalized, that is, it turns into a noun. The noun becomes an entity that can exist by itself. Now, let me explain this to you and how it operates. So if my behavior is honesty, integrity, and respect, these are my practices: integrity, honesty, and respect. If these are my practices, then these are my practices. Anyone else I interact with will experience those practices, and that's it. Now, why is it then I need to give a name to a certain set of practices and then group those practices and say that this grouping of practices is such and such? Notice what's happening. A material behavior that is finite is being turned into a nominal, which is infinite, right? In this case, perhaps we can think about it in, for example, religion. Religion is a set of performances and practices. But once it's turned into a nominal and given names, then you associate it with symbols, so that you have symbolic relationships between elements which is not considered a religion. And the practice itself is removed. This is a linguistic, it's a language game, which turns practices into nominals. In linguistics, we call it nominalization. Now, notice nominalization works really well when we deal with non-human elements. So when we take something like evaporate, the water evaporates, the water condenses. We call it evaporation and condensation, which is a nominalization. It's fine, because through nominalization, we study condensation, which is the process through which something condenses, which is fine. But When we apply the same process of nominalization to human behaviors and practices, we create a duality through which the human practice which we perform and what we call it and its symbolic representations become two distinct things. One is finite, as the other is infinite. And notice how all the academic discourses, especially social sciences, but not just, are all about debating and discoursing though that infinite, that nominal, right? So whether we are doing language is the same. Language is essentially oral, always oral, because writing is a representation of linguistic meaning, right? And Gulbahar will tell us this better than others, that there are different writing systems. And in certain writing systems, you don't have to have a reliance on sound at all, right? So the Chinese system is not reliant on sound, so that you can have different dialect groups which are not mutually intelligible, yet can communicate through a single writing system. Why? Because the writing system is purely visual. It is not tied down by like English does or European languages do. In fact, the European language systems are the worst. And then to take those worst writing systems being the language writing systems which peg one character to one sound, not even a syllable. Syllabic systems are much better than phonemic systems. And yet the European languages use phonemic systems, but not only do they just use the phonemic systems, and here comes an example of colonization. When we practice linguistics and we create language scripts and writing systems for different languages around the world, look at what the linguists do. They create phonemic writing systems for all of them. Why? Phonemic writing systems are the worst writing systems. Why are we doing that? Why? Because we've been trained through European linguistics, and European languages use a phonemic system. That's why. That's what I mean by colonization. The very disciplines and the orientations within the discipline that we take. So Jessica, you were saying we were trained in linguistics. I actually said linguistics is one of the worst of the disciplines. One of the worst. Because it was used primarily to divide people. You asked me to talk about Pakistan. It's very hard for me to talk about Pakistan because my parents were born in British India. Bangladesh used to be part, right? I can't see those divisions. Right. In fact, sometimes I say the name USA, United States of America, is a misnomer. It should be called UCA, United Colonies of America. And the term USA should be reserved for the United South Asia.
Okay. Well,
United South Asia. That's what United South Asia was before the colonization split it up. And it did not have conflicts with Persia. It did not have conflicts with China. It had peaceful relationships with those regions. Notice it's the creation of the countries, which again is creating another nominal, creating nominals and using those nominals to divide people, create categories, dominate people, create the idea of money, create all of these things. Language itself is an act. When you study linguistics, linguistics is a nominal. Language itself is a performance. The study is not. And then people can debate about theories of language, but none of them really are about anything because language only exists when it is being performed. Without its performance, it doesn't exist. Right? And yet, when we work in universities and academic disciplines, we become blinded by this. And we feel that linguistics as it's something by itself, or sociology exists in itself, or anthropology exists in itself. It doesn't. All of these disciplines didn't even exist 100 years ago. They were all created in Western European universities. And that is another example of colonization. Why is it that in a different part, because we borrow them from where? From our colonizers. So colonization hasn't ended. It hasn't ended. We can't talk about decolonization without really understanding that colonization hasn't ended. We don't live in a post-colonial world. Post-colonial would mean that we are decolonized, right? Notice how these nominals are created, and I will talk about this later again. I'm going to stop now. But decolonization is practice. It's not a nominal.
Okay, so
Right?
then talk about the practice. What do we do to decolonize?
Practice it. Change your performances. Change the way that you deal with money. Change with the way that you interact with people. Realize, for example, it took me a long time to realize that there is something called a universal human currency. There is a human currency that's universal, and guess what? It is not a dollar sign. It's in fact not any monetary currency at all.
What
The
is it?
universal human currency is respect. You give respect and you receive respect. I am a nomad. I travel around. I meet all kinds of people. I never feel threatened. People often ask me, aren't you afraid? I said, of what? If you treat people with respect, you get respect back. It's one of those currencies. The more you spend, the more you get. As opposed to the colonial idea of a currency where you spend it and you have none left.
That is an excellent one. It's not, yes, respect is so tremendously important that if you respect, you not only get respect back, but you also get many more contributions for having been respected. It's disrespect is the biggest D motivator.
One interesting thing, I thought you were going to say love, because, and when I think of religion, I think God is love. And and I have some videos that I made about how I give joy to get joy, and I give love. And if you give love, it's a force multiplier. I'll use a very innocuous example. I was at a dinner. It was a corporate dinner, but it was with families, and we had a table of 10 people. And it was unexpectedly cool for this very warm location we were in. And there was a baby in a mother's arms, and the baby was cold. And I just couldn't stand the fact that the baby was cold. And, the parents were just not, it wasn't their fault. They weren't, being mean to the child. But we had this free kind of resort money. And I went to the resort shop and I bought a sweatshirt, and I gave it to the baby. And the entire table, but initially our entire table was so excited, and this baby was warm and snuggly, and the parents' smiles were huge. And then that love spread to the other tables. Like, it wasn't about corporate anymore. It was about this baby. And so I see also love as a universal human currency.
That's fantastic, Jessica. I think that's a really good topic to talk about. I know it's not the topic of the day, but love, what is love? Because it's one of those things that people love to talk about, love, right? and notice, love is an emotion.
It's also a verb.
Right? Love is an emotion, and the performance of love as a behavior is understood as a number of different sets of behaviors. So love incorporates respect in that sense, and respect also incorporates love in that sense. And these terms, respect, integrity, kindness, they're all sort of interrelated. And I think that's great. I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but I'm trying to sort of talk about how love can be seen not as something that's different from respect, but actually they're the two are integrated. They're the same. Without respect, there is no love. Without love, there is no respect. Right. So I think rather than using these terms, again, notice these are all nominals, which break up the notion of this emotion and behavior through English terminology and lexicology in all these different ways. But we don't always need to break up these concepts in these ways. And you were talking about how do we behave through decolonization. One thing we do, and this is very difficult, is actually to question and every category that we assume. I'll give you an example. This is color terms. We all use color terms all the time. There's this metaphor of a colors and things that I've used to play with. I've abandoned it, and in fact, the story I will tell you is about why I abandoned it. But before I abandon it, I will tell you what it was, because I thought it was going somewhere. So I was working on this poem where I wanted to represent this idea that essentially, rivers flow around the world, and often, rivers come down different mountains, and then they merge. And when they merge, the river becomes bigger, right? So as the more rivers merge, the river keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So that's the idea. And I said, well, what if, for example, there's this one river in some mountain where, all these rivers around all these valleys are beautiful and diverse and has different colors and different birds and different rainbows, and it's this beautiful river coming down with all these different colors. And there's this other river that for some reason has some kind of a virus, maybe a coronavirus or something, and then some kind, but it's not a biological virus, but it's a socio-semiotic virus that affects the human ways of thinking and engaging with the world. So it's not something that engages with our material biology, but it's a virus that affects the way that our brain operates, which is essentially colonization, really. And so this because, we need to recognize that before the Western European powers went out and colonized the rest of the world, they colonized their own people first, right? So the Irish were one of the first slaves, right, for the English before others became slaves. So, these are, again, as Gulbahar also mentioned, these are really complex sort of histories. So we are aware that these are complex histories. But let's just say that this river coming down, which has this socio-semiotic virus, and these other rivers, this is all beautiful. And this time, instead of merging and the river becoming big, this virus creeps in to the other colorful river and starts killing that river off, right? It kills that river off. And I was narrating this story, this idea, this sort of dream, in a sense, of vision, to one of my elders up in Coen, in far north Queensland, and who's an Indigenous fella, and brother, Kevin. This is what he did. Let me just perform it for you, not in his accent and language, unfortunately, but just trying to imitate his performance. So I'm telling him all this story, very excited. He said, oh. Don't use those color words. They burned my eyes. And he's going like this. And I was like, what? Why is he closing his eyes, covering his eyes, saying that the color terms are burning his eyes? What did I say that is burning his eyes? And so I didn't understand, because for me, all that I was saying was creating a metaphor of how beautiful something was and how it's being destroyed. So why is that the representation of the beauty through the colors that I was talking about offensive to him and hurtful to him? So I asked him, and in response, he said, let's go out. So we were sitting in a shed. We got up, we went out, and we looked up. Just outside was the bush. And he just pointed it out to me, and he just showed it. He said, look at that. Look at what's around you. You do that too. Do that. Just move your face away from the screen for a second and look at whatever you're seeing. Just look at it. Look at it very carefully. Can you see all the different things you can see? Not on the screen, not on the computer, on a side. It doesn't matter which side. Can you see all those things? Everything. Can you see them? Yes?
Yes.
Good. They are for your eyes only. They're only for your eyes. He said that to me, and it took me weeks, and I think I still haven't really fully understood what he meant. But over a period of time and living in community, I started to realize that things don't have to be given a name. And the idea that humans need language to communicate everything is based on a very colonial idea of what a language is and what a language does. Because if you think of a language as a non-colonial context, people use oral verbal language only in presence of somebody else, right? So that my verbal language, as opposed to writing, forget writing, right? It's visual. My oral language, when I use oral language, it will be in presence of somebody else. If it is meant for somebody else. If it's not meant for somebody else, it's different. I'm just talking to myself. That's fine. But if I'm using performing language in somebody else, guess what? Something is happening that is not happening at this point. What is happening? What is happening is the person that I'm talking with, the person I'm using language with, that person and I cohabit the same physical space. We cohabit the same space. Therefore, we don't need to name everything because everything is shared between us. It's visible to us. As opposed to us here. When I ask you to look around and see things, I don't know what you're looking at. There's no way for me to know. The same as you don't know what I'm looking at.
I'm looking at my potato chips.
Unless you turn around your camera or you show it to me, it's not visible.
No.
Right? So notice that physical presence means that there's so much shared that the dependency on language decreases. In fact, in certain contexts, language becomes a liability, not a resource. Let me exemplify. I go out hunting for a kangaroo or a wallaby with 3 of my buddies. I say to my buddy, hey, Kevin, bro, there's a list. Let's go get that wallaby right there, bro. Guess what? By the time I've even said, hey, that wallaby is gone. Right? The wallaby is going to hear you. It's going to run away.
Yeah.
Oral language becomes a liability when you're going out hunting. In a non-colonial context, you don't have guns to shoot things from meters away. So instead, what will you do? I will say, hey, I won't say anything at all. I will say, or something like that. Right? No human language. Gestures, facial expressions, whistling maybe, imitation of natural sounds maybe. Guess what? I'm serving a socio-semiotic purpose within the context we are planning. And if we are successful in the hunt, then our planning was successful because we have a hunt. But notice no language was actually uttered because you don't need it. The dependency on human language increases with our distance, our social distance. So I need more language with you guys than I need with my partner because, again, we share. For me to be able to express something to you, I have to verbalize this as much as I can. But for people who are around me, I don't. So notice our dependency on language itself varies. And the notion of our needing all these categories, even color terms, is not necessarily universal. So as linguistics students, I remember back in my undergrad days learning about Berlin and Kay and all the color theories and the color terms and the hierarchy of what terms there are and what languages have what terms and all those things. I remember doing that stuff. And I remember even teaching that stuff. But it was in living in that community that for the first time made me realize that all that research is BS. It's bullshit. Because it has nothing to do with the conceptualization of what colors you need or don't need or nothing. No, because everybody can see them. It's a choice, and I use the word choice because the choice means that they do have an option of using terms because there is a visual element there, right? But they're not choosing to name it. This is not done deliberately by an individual, but a social group. So that the grammar of a language that evolves is a consensus within the community. And that's why languages can vary and change and shift idiosyncratically. Right? So by rethinking language from not a colonial perspective, moving away from linking literacy to language, moving that out, we start to see what Boli or oral language is, how it relates to conceptualizations of the world, how it relates to indigenous ways of knowledge making, transference of knowledge from generation to generation. The thought, for example, in certain communities that the act of naming is oppressive because when you name something, it becomes real, as opposed to when you don't name it, it doesn't. The idea of indigenous ways of creating mysteries and mythologizing things that didn't need to be understood because they couldn't be. And so we're left alone, especially things that were of an infinite nature, right? So indigenous knowledges, indigenous languages have a really sophisticated way of explaining to us what the geographical elements are within their context, what the different flora and fauna are, what their uses are, what their ways of, of all the details that are, are of human relevance to the geography in which they live. The indigenous languages are amazing. Why? Because they have such a long contact with that finite context, right? Long contact with a finite context helps develop understandings and elaborations and depth of understandings. That is what indigenous knowledge and sciences were. Now you transfer that to what the Western and modern sort of sciences do. We want to seek the infinite. Let's think of something that we all were taught to dream about from our childhood, about the space. Look at how many spaceships that we send out into the space, all of this stuff, all the time. Notice this desire to learn about space is a desire to learn the infinite. The space out there is infinite. But to get access to the space, we need finite. We need something that is finite, that is converted as a resource that allows us to go into that space so that we can learn about this infinite, this sense of knowledge, which is infinite. Knowledge itself is infinite. There is no limit to it. The knowledge about space is infinite. But to get that infinite, you need a resource. Unfortunately, those resources are finite. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that if your goal is infinite and your resources are finite, that guess what? You're going to run out of your resources before you reach your goal. Why? Because the goal is endless and your resources are limited. And that is somehow how the current approaches to knowledge and knowledge construction tend to have accepted this as an axiom, not just an assumption. It's an assumption because we don't even identify this as an assumption. It is an axiom that knowledge is the goal, without ever thinking that knowledge is an infinite. And setting an infinite as a goal is committing suicide. Just like the economic system, making money your goal is suicide because it's infinite. You can never achieve it. So that's what, in a sense, practice of decolonization implies, is a shift away from the infinites back to the finites. Make finite your goal, not the infinite, because the infinite is unachievable. Make the finite your goal. Make something that is actually theoretically possible your goal, so that you can start achieving it. And perhaps in generations or time, we can achieve it because it is achievable. As opposed to what we're setting up goals that are unachievable. By definition, by their very definition, they're unachievable. That is what colonization has done to our sense of knowledge making, to our sense of all this. Why? Because notice, practices to nominals. Practices, material, biological, is finite. Nominals, ideas, theories, beliefs are infinite. You move from the finite to the infinite. You create the infinite as the discursive space for things to operate. And we end up in the world that we have today. Anyway, that's a very long answer to your question. I'm going to stop.
I really want to give Dr. Beckett a chance to talk, but for one quickly, if you can, Ahmar, for the non-academics who might watch this, can you give us an example of how any normal common person could switch from infinite to finite?
So everybody can and should do it. Really, think about I like to just like, you can sort the world in many different ways. And sorting is primary science.
Sorting.
Anything, sorting things, making piles, making groups, making categories, making classifications. That is the primary science. Anything we do with that, whether it's through methodology or application, is methodology or application. It is not science. Primarily, science is sorting. It's classification and categorization. And categorization and classification can happen in many, 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 many ways. In fact, there are infinite ways of doing it. One way of doing it, within that infinite, is a category called finite and infinite. Anything that is limited is bound, limited is finite. Anything that is not bound is infinite, right?
Yeah.
Now, let's just categorize the things that we know. Water, is it finite or infinite? It's finite. Our lifespan, is it finite or infinite? Finite. Knowledge, is it finite or infinite? Infinite. Money, is it finite or infinite? Infinite. Right? Number of trees and species, finite or infinite? Finite. Right? Faith, belief, finite or infinite? Infinite. So by going through this process and thinking about each of these things as whether it's finite or infinite, you can start seeing where we have set our goals. Right? Notice integrity, honesty, love, respect, all of those terms, those concepts. Those are practices, they're finite. If you don't practice it, it doesn't exist. Whether you call yourself X religion or X spirituality or Y religion or Y spirituality, it doesn't matter. You can be A, B, C, D, or E, or it doesn't matter what you are. If you have the practice, you have the practice. And if you don't have the practice, you don't have the practice. Labels don't matter.
Okay.
Right? So notice those labels are infinite. Practice is finite. Anything that you can experience through your material senses, sight, sound, right? Smell, touch, and taste in this particular sequence, right? Through any of these sensory systems that you might have, that you experience is finite. Anything that you think about and comes to you through your thinking, not through your observation and experience, material experience, is essentially infinite. That's a way to categorize the two. And once we start doing that, essentially what we need to be working and focused on is how do we focus on the finite? The knowledge is infinite, which means it exists, and then it's infinite. Our lifespan is not. So therefore, instead of using our lifespan as a resource to gain knowledge, let's use knowledge to improve the finite, our lifespan. Because knowledge already exists. You can't create it. It's already there. It's infinite.
So improve your environment with your knowledge.
Improve your lifespan. Improve the geographical location in which you're in, the people who are around, the animals, the wildlife, the trees, all of that. Engage with that because that's the finite. Right? Because that's where you can do something. When you engage with your neighbors and when you live in a place and you do things, things change because it's finite. Writing a research paper, adding to the infinite makes no difference to the world. Nobody even reads those papers, and it doesn't translate into experience.
Are you saying that because my most recent publication just came out? Okay, so Ahmar has had the floor for some time, and Gulbahar, I'd love to have your ideas be expressed.
Well, I think that is actually that was great answer to your question. I think what Ahmar said is really, I think, is getting people to think about what is it that they can utilize what they know or can know to change what they can in their own respective contexts, right, Ahmar? So I think that's more profound and more useful than just one example, because if I were to give one example that may apply to my situation, or actually this goes back to Ahmar's example of look around what you see, and come back and what do you see? So we see the three of us when we are looking at the screen, and when we look around, we see numerous things, right? So I think what he's really saying is that see what needs to be done in everybody's given context, and go and utilize what we know, what we can know, to start making changes that can be changed, right?
Yeah, one commonality between all of us is a focus on performance and actually doing things. So
speaking of reading, I'd like to respond to Ahmar's question about nobody reads the papers. That actually got me thinking, as I told you earlier, that I started paying attention to colonization and decolonization more specifically recently because of what's happening in my country here. And also I read that about what's happening in Europe, in Canada, etc. too, and Australia. So that got me thinking that, okay, how did we get here, right? From hundreds of years of colonization, and why now that these actions are happening? So it made me think that those papers may have mattered. Those discussions that we had with students, somebody had with us when we were students, and probably mattered. Some enough students who are now also professors understood, they started educating others. And finally, there's a critical mass of people who understood, read the paper, some papers at least, understood some of the discussions. And probably that's why we are seeing the actions that's being taken place. I seriously thought, okay, so what happened? Why is it happening now? And what made this action, what led to the actions that are taking place? So I'm thinking that maybe people don't read every paper, but but I think the publications might be necessary. Somebody may read something, right? And what you and I write might be read by some students, and our students would write something, perhaps would be read by different people. So together they may reach more people, and therefore the changes to the finite, the choice of what the finites are, could be informed by the infinite knowledge that as a community of scholars and intellectuals that we can produce. So keep writing and keep publishing too. I think that to make contribution.
One thing that I think is relevant here is that we all, the three of us, we share a commonality in the focus on actually doing things. And whether as a language teacher, you want your students to be engaged in meaningful activities. You were saying the other day, Dr. Beckett, projects, create a project together. And then you have this thing about which to communicate. And Ahmar, we were talking about the pursuit of education for the pursuit of education, and that, not everybody, and I'm not trying to be in any way condescending, like not everybody needs to go to college. I was telling my privileged Chinese students the other day that plumbers. If you own a plumbing business, you're instantly a millionaire because nobody wants to be a plumber. But that service is needed. Every community needs these services, and you don't have to aspire to be something infinite. You can solve a problem in your community, period. So I'm trying to bring the finite and the physically doing things. And I'll tell you what I tell my students. Also, I say this often. They'll say, "I love my parents." Respecting my parents is my #1 core value. I love it when the students say this. And then, it's about midterms when at least half the class has done half their homework. And I'll say, so if you love your parents and they invested all of this money in you, what are you actually doing to demonstrate your respect and love for your parents? Because I don't see it. You don't get to say respect is my #1 value if you're not doing something. And I think that's what, Ahmar, I think the three of us would say, do something good in your finite community, period.
Well, yeah, it appears that, well, actually not appears, sounds too academic, but we are seeing the action and that are taking place everywhere. And again, I think that this takes time. One needs to learn what's going on and for instance, even why we know what we know, why we do what we do. And apparently that took a lot of decades of studying, thinking, discussing, and now it looks like it's action time. People are taking actions. Yes. Yeah. But my point is that without the discussion, without the studying, without consciousness raising, etc., this action doesn't happen. So it
consciousness,
now it's yes.
Awareness.
Yeah.
And one aspect I think of is, so one of my core values is co-rising, that if one country succeeds and the others fail, well, then we all fail. So that we all have to co-rise together, all ethnicities, all religions, and our definition of us should expand. Prior to the division in Ahmar's USA, United South Asia, prior to that, the Muslims and the Hindus, they loved each other and they viewed themselves as one. And if we can all view each other as ones, and we don't have to say, oh, he's Christian and oh, he's Jewish, or, we're doing all of this labeling thing, that if we can just see each other as one, then we don't have to other anyone, and we can all rise together. I know that's a big dream, but
no, I think this goes back to what Ahmar was saying about this finite and infinite, actually, perfectly, because people are going after this. There's only infinite number of something that we need to get, and that which should belong to only us, whoever that us is. That creates this competition, and then also the root of colonization. The more I colonize, the more I get from the colonies, kind of idea. And again, this is not just one peoples and one race. It happens everywhere and by anybody. So I agree with you. If we see, again, back to what Ahmar was saying, things are infinite, that we could together contribute to this, make the finite infinite, then this includes like every category. People, of course, the different races, different ethnicity, male, female, etc. Rather than, only males can do this, females should be yada yada. If we all come together to contribute to the world together, there is so many more things that we can discover. there's so much peace that we could build together. And rather than somebody has to be down for me to be up, no, together we could be up higher, and we could be much richer in every way: money, love, respect. So yes, absolutely agree with what you're saying, and that ties back to Ahmar's intellectual point earlier, philosophical point. Yeah.
So we've reached the point of no return. You know, the hour is about the point that people start to nod off. So I'm happy to have us meet again, but I'd like to know if anybody has any concluding thoughts. Does anybody want to start?
There's just been such an interesting conversation. There's so much I'm just thinking about as I'm just listening to both of you. I will very briefly say one thing, again, an abstraction to sort of bring together a number of things that just been talked about. And then I will go to shift to something very concrete, and I'll end, just like I started with a poem, I'm going to end with a poem. And this is some poem that I haven't really shared with people much. Very few people actually know about it. It's up. So I'll read it here first. Anyway, so before I get there, the abstraction. Remember when I was saying that there are multiple infinite ways of creating categories, right? It's also really interesting if you look at the ways that current dominant ways of knowledge construction has been legitimized through academia and publications. You will notice that by and large, especially in the traditional disciplines, forget the infinite, forget even 10, they only have 2 ways of constructing knowledge. Pretty much all Western disciplines, regardless of what discipline it is, whether it is social sciences or hard sciences, it doesn't matter. They only have 2 ways, only two ways of making knowledge. Of all the infinite ways, 2 ways. Number 1, genealogy. Looking at genealogical relationship between elements, whether it is in a biological species or it's across languages or cultures or even religions, looking at genealogies, right? And that's number 1. Now, to achieve that first one, they need a second one. And the second comes in 2 alternative and co-ways, which are structural and functional distinctions. Do a structural and functional analysis, and using structural and functional analysis, they talk about genealogies. That is it. Whether you're looking at biology or linguistics or cultural studies, it doesn't matter. Every freaking European discipline does the same. Genealogies and structural functional analysis. That's it. Nothing else. Of all the infinite ways, they don't do anything. And then they say that these are the only 2 legitimate ways of doing it. They're the worst ways of doing it. They're dividing things on structure and function, which is the basis of things like race and language and all that shit. And then they're putting it into genealogies and creating hierarchies. Horrible. These are the worst ways of creating knowledge. No wonder divide and rule is not a political ideology. Divide and rule exists within the academic domains. We, the knowledge producers, operate on divide and rule, and we produce knowledge that is based on divide and rule, so that the knowledge and publications that we produce through corporate publishers. I have nothing against publishing and sharing, but not for corporate greed. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, most publication is based on corporate greed and supports corporate greed. In fact, we need to question, why is academia, which is a free institution, supporting a corporate industry? The publication industry cannot exist without academia. Mm-hmm. And yet the academia gets no benefit out of it. Where's the ethics in that? Right? Where's the ethics of publishing for corporate industries? And in fact, in most of my recent work, I've stopped doing it. I've moved away from corporate publishers, and I'm doing it more and more and more. And as much as I can, living within the world that I live in, right? So I'm just wanted to bring that out. So it's the knowledge construction and the ways of knowledge construction where the divide and rule exists. And that is why we need to abandon these ways of knowledge construction. Divide and rule, genealogies, structural function analysis are poison. They're horrible. They're the worst ways of doing knowledge. Throw them away. Decolonization of knowledge production is get rid of any knowledge production that is focusing on genealogies, which are divisive, and on structure and functional analysis, which are also divisive. Get rid of them. Do something different. There's an infinite ways of creating categories. Not all of them will work, but it's that trial and error and variations and diversities that leads to the beauty. You know, going back to my adopted country of far north Queensland, it's in the region of where we have what we call the Daintree rainforest. Now, if you Google search Daintree rainforest, you will realize that the Daintree rainforest is the oldest living bush in the world. It's been around since before the dinosaurs, right? And still around. And guess what? When you observe, when you live, and when you're part of that bush, you realize that the diversity in that bush is immense. And that wakes you up to this observation. Hey, for something to exist for so long and to be strong and be able to withhold and withstand all the various calamities and natural disasters, guess how it survived? It survived through diversity. It is the diversity and the variations that enabled it to be able to thrive. You reduce that variation down to singularities and the forest will die, which is what we are seeing around the world. The bush is dying. Why? Because we are selectively taking things out. Why? Because we have this notion of Darwinian evolution. Guess what? Darwinian evolution, genealogy, structure, function, nothing else. It's not that Darwin was blind to the fact that evolution is never independent for a species. Evolution always happens through co-evolution. It's not evolution of one species, it's co-evolution of all species, just like co-rising. It's co-evolution not just of humans or within a human groupings, it's across species. It's not co-rising because that sees us as humans. It's co-evolution. We live in a world that is co-evolving. And when we take one species and change its ways of engaging with the rest of the species will disbalance because it's co-evolution. Evolution doesn't exist for a species. It doesn't. There is no evidence for it. And yet, academic domains create these myths. It's always co-evolution. It's always co-evolution. You cannot there is no reason to have structural and functional and genealogical studies. No reason. When the focus is on co-evolution and the focus is on the finite, there is no need for stupid theories that don't even represent the world, and yet create a discursive world through writings and literature and academic discourses that create and generate knowledge and thinking and policies that influence the material world we exist in. And it is that contradiction that is allowed to exist within the academic domains by creating the duality of action, material versus the nominal, which doesn't exist. Right? Okay. Anyway, I'm going to stop that there. I know it's a lot, and I'm trying to abstract out essentially what you guys have really said as examples of that is how it's the process of knowledge construction that we need to look at. I'm going to stop here. As I said, I'll just share my poem, and then I'll skip, and then I'll let me just share a screen here. And this time I will share a PowerPoint screen. Is it sharing? Yeah. So it's a poem that I've written recently. It's one of my good-do poems. So it's a conversation. This poem is a conversation between a young child and an adult. In this case, it's a dad and a son. Papa, what is future, and how can we plan for it? Little Guddu asked one day. Now, don't ask me why little Guddu asked that question. He just asked it, all right? Okay. So, Papa, what is future, and how can we plan for it? Little Guddu asked one day. Wow, what a great question, Guddu. Future, like past, are moments where we cannot act. So you can kick the ball you have now. You can do it now because you're in present. You can kick, you can act. You cannot act in yesterday or tomorrow. I see. I can't go back to yesterday and kick the ball then. Guddu checked. And I can't kick the ball tomorrow, as now is today. Yes, you're right. You can only do things now, in your present, when you can take action. Come now, let us go play with the ball to prepare for what you need to do. You need to start doing it. Yay, I'm going to practice today and win tomorrow, Guddu said with excitement as he ran out to the park with his ball. So I just want to end here by stressing the importance of now. It is now that we need to act, because whatever the beautiful future that we are imagining tomorrow is, that beautiful tomorrow cannot exist if we do not have practice now in the present.
Good conclusion. Okay, and I'm Gulbahar. Can we have your brief conclusion?
Well, I think that was very well done. I don't think I can do better than that, so we can leave it there.
Okay. Well, I'd love to continue this conversation. There are many people who have been contacting me today to make this conversation even larger. So I'd love to have you both back sometime soon. Yes? Okay, wonderful. All right, so for now, I'll say goodbye. Thank you for joining me today. Okay. You've just been watching an interview with Dr. Gulbahar Beckett and Ahmar Mahboob about decolonization and revitalizing Indigenous knowledges. Thank you for joining us.